another episode of the Airport Communities Podcast. I am your host, J.C. Harris. Apparently we screwed up with this episode's predecessor, Maps Are Good. We sort of assumed that if we did an episode about maps, people would, watch the video, and we got some notes. That's on us. If you do a podcast, I suppose it implies an audio format, but just going forward, whenever we do an episode with maps in the title, it will probably be better experienced on the video feed. We said that the state legislative session had been a fail, and it was so complicated we haven't figured out how to put it into anything like a one-pager. We thought it might be good to break this into pieces. This episode will focus on what is going wrong with port package updates. And we thought that using maps might make this clearer. If some of this seems like review, just fast forward. In our last episode, we introduced some maps and an overview of several big concepts we'll be using over the next year. As we said, most of airport law actually has to do with land. Sorry, Gone with the Wind fan. The specifics will differ depending on your airport because every airport is very different. But the concepts are all pretty much the same. In my most impressive sword and sandals manner, I mentioned the center of the known universe, the midpoint of the runways, and I have promised not to do that again. One of the concepts we covered last time was DNL 65, the noise contour that determines who gets sound insulation and who might have been eligible for property buyouts back in the day. Now, the original DNL 65, the OG DNL 65, extended all the way down into what is now Federal Way and way up to the north in Georgetown. That was the original Part 150 study, and that boundary existed from 1985 to about 2013. Every home, apartment building, church, whatever that has ever received sound insulation has been inside that boundary. It's never gotten bigger. Over the years, there were several Part 150 studies, and you can read all of them at stni.info. And the FAA kept telling the airport year after year, despite large expected increases in travel, this boundary was going to shrink dramatically. Why? There are two terms used interchangeably in airport law which are very different but sound a lot alike: mitigation and abatement. Abatement is what people really want. It means preventing the source of the noise in the first place, either by making the planes go somewhere else, changing flight paths, or making the airplanes quieter. Mitigation is the consolation prize. It refers to counteracting the impacts you cannot abate. For example, sound insulation. The FAA was working with industry on abatement to make aircraft quieter. They pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into research and grants, and they succeeded to a certain extent. Aircraft today quieter on an individual basis than the old 747s and 707s. Anyway, in 2013, the contour did finally change, but rather than shrinking gradually over time, in 2013, the contour was reduced to what it essentially is today, about a third the size of the original. To help put that in perspective, let's revisit something we mentioned last time, the noise remedy boundary, what we called the choppy choppy. Notice I said boundary and not contour. When they do a Part 150 study, they do all this computer modeling based on formulas and different softwares over the years. The current one is called AEDT for people keeping score, but they don't use microphones to develop that contour. The contour is the curvy, smoothie. That's phase one of every Part 150 study, and that's actually the fast part. You could do it in a few months if there weren't all these pesky community engagement requirements, all those open houses and so forth. That's what takes forever. They are expensive and frankly, totally performative. Well, why so snarky, JC? Well, the port held 4 of these events, and after all that effort, a whopping 230 people signed up. This is out of a potential resident base of over 100,000. Whoopee! Now, that is not their fault, by the way. The slow part, phase 2, is a process called block rounding. Well, there's other stuff, but this is the main thing. Or end of block, where they convert that curve into the actual street parcels, what we call the choppy choppy. Now, back in the day, and it sounds so ridiculous that people struggle to believe it, the contour would just be a contour, so it would end up going right through the middle of someone's house. In many cases, dozens, the Port of Seattle provided sound insulation for the front half of a home, but not the back. Over time, the process became more realistic, fair, moral, ethical, use your term. But one thing it was not was some crisis of conscience. The practice became standardized only after really a lot of complaining and lawsuits by other airport communities, such as LAX. Almost nothing concerning improvements to the process happens just out of the goodness of people's hearts. Regardless, the Port of Seattle, like other airports, now make an effort to do block rounding. Hopefully your city's community planner is on top of this and is actively working to obtain as many homes as possible from the smoothie contour to the choppy boundary. Because block rounding can be conservative or expansive. It's a negotiation. It has to be approved by the FAA because ultimately they provide the funding. So you can't just start adding blocks and blocks. But within reason, you can go to the end of a block, a cul-de-sac, the edge of a park, not through the middle of a guy's house. You just need to be reasonable. Well, that's the theory. But given the fact that so few people understand the stakes involved or participate in those community meetings, it really depends on a few people, hopefully you, to engage. Now, people don't live in contours or boundaries, they live in houses. Of the roughly 9,400 plus structures that were sound insulated, less than 9,000 are still in service. Some no longer exist. Fire, demolition, the homeowner replaced their own windows, usually with something less expensive and less effective. But regardless, there had been a few done as part of the second runway. Let's call that a trial run. But back then, the primary efforts towards noise was abatement, meaning property buyouts. The vast majority, well over 90% of homes that have been sound insulated were done in a very short period of time during the third runway, 1998 to about 2005. Now within the current noise boundary, which is significantly smaller, you might ask how many of those properties would have been eligible if the whole program were done today. Great question. Of the homes that were sound insulated, about a third fall within the current DNL 65. Those are homes that, if never previously been provided sound insulation, would be eligible for a first-time port package today. Coincidentally, they are also homes that might be eligible for an update, a second chance, depending on ongoing back and forth between the Port of Seattle and the FAA, meaning federal funding. The other 2/3 who are outside the current DNL 65 boundary, they get bugger all, as we say back home. Currently, there is legislation to provide FAA money for those currently eligible port package areas. This is tricky. There is legislation for money to provide a second chance for the 1/3 of homes inside the current DNL 65. Thank you, Congressman Smith and Senator Murray. However, to obtain that, they got an earmark buried into a defense authorization bill, not the FAA. That should tell you a couple of things. First of all, said it before, say it again. Part 150 or the FAA have never been the only options for funding. It all depends on the willingness and creativity and passion of your electeds to find other ways to get this done. If someone says, we can't get her done via the FAA, say thank you and tell them to try somewhere else. Also, putting something into a bill is not the same thing as developing a regulation or appropriating money or getting your home fixed. Remember that Schoolhouse Rock jingle?
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
It's a great song. It's wrong. Even after a bill is signed, there is still a multi-step process to get it funded and turned into something real. But if you say 10 Hail Marys and 4 Our Fathers, it will still take at least 2 more years before it could be operational. We're harping on this because whenever the port says, look at what's happening, they're talking about something at least a couple of years down the road. Still with us? Now, you may have been one of those 230 people who attended community meetings where the Port of Seattle and cities talked about the Part 150 study and a new noise analysis. Times change and airport operations have grown quite a bit. So you might have reasonably expected that the boundary would have changed significantly. Honestly, it's not that different from the current 2025 boundary. In terms of raw area, it's actually quite similar. It's likely to shift a bit to the west to account for higher usage of the third runway, coupled with the fact that there are just more homes remaining there. The result will probably be a few dozen additional homes becoming eligible for first-time sound insulation. Mainly because some residents declined sound insulation originally. They were holding out for a property buyout or a billion-dollar class action suit or something, which never materialized. So, despite all the increases in operations, the changes will appear modest. A little in Des Moines, a little bit more to the north. The more dramatic change involves DNL 70, something we haven't talked about much at all. It's 5 units larger than DNL 65. That inner zone has grown significantly. So what does that mean for property owners? Probably not that much. Not trying to sound flip. The lived experience between DNL 65 and DNL 70 is significant. It takes a lot to move that number up even 1 or 2 units. But in terms of any kind of mitigation or abatement, it likely won't mean a thing. Historically, DNL 75 was the threshold the FAA used for property buyouts. 65 was sound insulation, and DNL 70 was this sort of purgatory. The FAA might buy the home, or rather the Port of Seattle would get money from the FAA to buy the home. Sorry, that's an important distinction. And they would insulate it and resell it because there will always be buyers. But what will not happen this time or any time in the near future is the FAA writing a check to a city like Burien, Des Moines, or Sea-Tac and letting each city decide what to do. There is no historical precedent for that. When property buyouts happen, the airport obtains ownership of the property. Usually it keeps it for itself. Sometimes it fixes it up and flips it. But cities never get a bite at the apple. I'm pressing on that because there is this ongoing myth that somehow cities could use this as an opportunity for independent land development. Now let's back up and talk about RCW 53. RCW 53 is the big chapter in the state code which talks about port districts. Port of Seattle is a port district. It has a section concerning noise mitigation, which was added because of Sea-Tac Airport. It was just jammed in there because the port is a port district. Could have gone somewhere else. But anyway, you needed a chapter that talked about noise mitigation programs to conform to the FAA. Anyway, originally when property owners signed their navigation easements, the document relinquishing rights to your airspace in exchange for that one-time sound insulation payment, state law said noise mitigation could be provided within the original 1991 boundary. However, thanks to Representatives Mike Policiotti, now State Treasurer, and Representatives Orwell and former Senator Kaiser, the state extended that boundary for possible state mitigation all the way south into Federal Way and north all the way up to Beacon Hill, 92 square miles, way beyond the original scope of Part 150. The idea was that the aviation impacts, departures and arrivals, go far beyond the DNL. Now, what to do with that big expansion has been a real discussion because it has no force of law at the federal level. You can't use it to get FAA money. It doesn't have any state grant funding. The law applies to the Port of Seattle and Sea-Tac operations. One of the unfortunate things of it being in the port section of the state code. There is also Boeing Field, KCIA is the more technical term, to the north, which shares the same airspace. So the question is, who is responsible for all the negative impacts of that 92 square miles, including noise, is genuinely complicated. Boeing Field has its own Part 150 program and its own sound insulation. We don't interact much with our counterparts to the north, but it's worth understanding that dynamic is real. So where does that leave us? Fighting a two-front war. The port's current argument is that homes nearest the runway are most worthy and should receive preference for sound insulation updates. That is not true. There is no correlation between the distance to the runway and the quality of a port package, not on any metric. Socioeconomics, ethnicity, minority, status, pollution, even noise. When you're 4, even 6 nautical miles from the runway, it's noisy. And statistically, the majority of bad port packages are outside the current DNL 65. But it's a convenient argument that allows them to say, just wait until that Smith-Murray bill goes into effect in 2028. On the other hand, the bills discussed in Olympia this year focused on sound insulation updates for everyone within that ginormous RCW boundary. What could be more inclusive? Everyone's a winner. But it was just as ridiculous in the opposite direction. The port could very reasonably argue that they can't be held responsible for sound insulation over such a broad swath of real estate, especially when there is a shared airspace and another airport with its own Part 150 process. Trying to develop a completely novel program would in itself take more years and more delay. Our position, if state funding were to arrive, there are plenty of eligible homes, 2/3 in fact, outside the current DNL. So start there. Harken back to the glory days of the original port packages. Remember we said that the port had done only a very few homes before the third runway? The reason the program became such a mess is that old engineer joke. You can have it fast, cheap, and good. Pick two. The program became a mess because they attempted to scale from a few a month to over 200. What could possibly go wrong? The current sound insulation program is much improved. The block rounding is now standard. The quality of each construction is much better. You're much more likely to get a good result, one that lasts, by having the Port of Seattle do it. But on the other hand, again, they're only doing a very few. They have no system in place to do more. So even if there were suddenly a ton of money, which is exactly what happened around the time of the third runway, the port would still have to scale up. Again, they will need time to learn how to not make those same mistakes. When federal money comes online, hopefully in 2028, see, I'm crossing myself as I read this, we should attack the remaining third, those inside the current DNL 65, aggressively. That will likely be a larger pool of funding from the FAA, and you'll be able to get a lot more homes done quickly. If we limit ourselves now to the 1/3 inside that boundary, which does not represent the majority of bad port packages, we're effectively telling the Port of Seattle they can do nothing until 2028 and then still leave 2/3 of the homes out in the cold. And they will have had no practice in scaling up. This should be unconscionable for decision makers at both state and federal level. They should have been thinking about how to work together, not only to find money in both buckets, and to develop oversight and a better program. Our position is simple. Every home under the original DNL 65 deserves sound insulation, including an update with a very simple qualification system. The SFO second chance model, and we'll have a link in the show notes there. Someone else did the groundwork for us, and we should follow along with an improved version. There's no need for us to be the beta testers. But regardless of where the money comes from any source within WA, the first priority must be the 2/3 of originally insulated homes, the ones that are now out in the cold, outside the current DNL 65, and ineligible for any federal funding. You cannot go to a state or federal meeting without hearing about all the benefits of the airport for the region, the state, the nation. Fine. Then every home under the flight path that ever receives sound insulation should be entitled to an up-to-date system, starting now.